Watch from the window.
Steven.
Steve, I'll see you around.
Steven.
Love you, Steve.
Steve. Steve.
What are you doing, Steve? Part of the deal, Steve. Steve. Okay, Steve.
Hey, Steve.
This is Steve. Steve. All right, Steve.
Chops.
Steve. Steve. Steve, hey. Steve.
No.
Steve. Steve is great.
Nope. It's just Steve.
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 Hey, Steve. Steve. Steve.
And Steve.
Steve.
Steve. Steve. Steve.
Steve. Steve.
Steve.
Steve. No. No, Steve. 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 Steve.
Steve.
Mike? John?
Steve.
Steve. Steve.
Steve.
Steve.
Steve.
Right, Steve. Steve.
Steve.
Steve.
Steve.
Steve. Steve.
Steve.
Steve. Steve. The iPod.
His name wouldn't be Steve, would it?
It's Steve.